Okay, boa tarde a todas e a todos. Sejam bem-vindos a este seminário. Obrigado pela vossa presença. Como sabem, será em inglês, por isso vou passar agora para inglês. So welcome everyone to this seminar session organized by CESA and iseg Research. We're really happy and honored to have here with us a long-time friend, Howard Stein. Howard is a professor at the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and also the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Michigan in the US. He's published widely, more than 100 papers, lots of books and edited books, on all sorts of issues around African political economy, economic development, you name it. And he's been generous enough to collaborate with us for a very long time. And we're really happy to have you here. So, floor is yours, Howard. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alexander. It's actually a great pleasure to be here again. I go all the way back from an invitation, I believe now 29 years ago, from Professor Oppenheimer. Here in 1996, I think I've come back to it, something like that. Yeah, I remember. I have to, but we met before in Geneva. So I've had a long history here in the old days when I used to be the Technical University of Lisbon, and then joined in, and of course also with Joanna, who's also a long-term member as well, and then Alexander, who's kind of taken over the reins some years back, and it's been a real pleasure to have this long-term relationship with the university. Now, the lecture I have today, what I tend to do is I do a lot of, I speak quickly, particularly when I start to move on. I tend to give a lot of detailed slides because English to many of my audiences is a second, third, or even fourth language, often in Africa. And so you'll see my slides are very detailed because sometimes people have trouble understanding my English because I speak so quickly. And it's better than with the written English for people that are able to write it. So I apologize for a lot of slides, but they're very detailed slides, which I hope to be able to follow it. In my old days, when I used to lecture at University of Dar es Salaam, I'm a Canadian / I live in the US too now. And my students used to say to me, they'd say, please, can you please talk with a British accent? We don't understand this Canadian American accent, but I won't give you my really bad British accent, but it used to be quite hilarious. So there's a lot to go through. It's a very long topic, which is the history of industry and manufacturing and industrial policy. I'm just now completing a book. So in 2014, I wrote the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa report on institutions and industrial policy in Africa, their annual report. And I didn't like what they made me do theoretically. So then I contracted a year later with Oxford University Press to produce the book I really wanted to do on that. And here we are, 10 years later? I'm finally finishing the manuscript. It's taken a lot of time with a lot of detours on the way. And so we're getting a bit of a flavor of that as I go through. I wanted to give you, because some of you have different background, a bit of the background of the history of industrialization in Africa and the different approaches. And then talking about something which is rarely discussed, which is the whole institutional mechanism that has to be in place for industrial policy to be effective. Often a lot of industrial policy is always these policies, those policies, what's the role of the market, how can you support it? But nobody's actually seeing and understanding the nature of what we call the industrial policy organizations that have to be in place and interconnected and a framework, which is often lost in mainstream economists, which I'm not, because they're typically very institutional. They are the very famous work by Ronald Coase, basically, who did his work on the firm. They called the firm a black box. How can you actually talk about an economy without talking about how companies actually operate in the real world? And so for a very long time, the way I classify myself is I'm a heterodox economist, but I'm very much embedded in original institutional economic theory that actually effectively identifies the centrality of these. So enough of a background. I'll try to leave some time. I wanted to cover 5 broad topics today. Talk a bit about manufacturing and its trajectory from the colonial period, the dismantling of institutions. Some of the most important ones are the national development banks and their history, with a little bit of a broad analysis of that. talk a bit about economic theory and industrial policy. I apologize, I'm an economist, so sometimes I do this stuff. I know others of you have different backgrounds, but I'll try to keep it accessible. And then really showing how institutional theory really helps that. And then the longest chapter we have on the book is one I wrote, which is on the kind of history of industrialization, industrial policy institutions in Kenya. You know, it's I think the chapter is more than 20,000 words. You know, and so it's a significant amount. So I wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of some examples of the theoretical approach and talk a bit about, you know, you can't just critique things, you've also come suggest about a way forward. And so I'll have some ideas of different approaches as we go forward and allow time for discussion. So basically, I've been around long enough, Professor Oppenheimer and others, you know, they also know the history that at one time there was an enormous recognition in the development economics literature on the centrality of manufacturing and industrialization. You know, people knew we had to go through that. And that was actually really known even at the independence period, but kind of forgotten over time because mainstream economics increasingly became ahistorical, you know, using kind of cliometrics as opposed to proper analysis of economic history. And then, in fact, then cutting themselves off from a real understanding of how economies actually transform. You know, so problem, if those are familiar, came with the Solo model. You know, basically changing the nature of kind of the constraints which came out of Harry Domar about what fixed the nature of fixed coefficients. Instead of putting in this world where you just keep expanding until you hit your decrease in returns. You know, and in some senses. Over time, economists moved away, and they even moved away from the big picture. So today, and I've written a bit on this, development economics is all about microeconomic studies with, you know, of what I'd call, they're kind of the envy of science, you know, in medicine, and they call them randomized controlled trials. This has now become the central element of development economics, you know, and it's very problematic. You really don't understand the underlying strategies. But there's also been some movement I'll talk about in mainstream economics towards some understanding of recognition of industrial policy, where at one time it was entirely forbidden. Now, what we knew from the old days, going back to the literature, that manufacturing was very important in the development process. Higher productivity associated with than other activities like service and agriculture, higher elasticities of income, meaning that as you raise your income, your demand for the products increase. Basically, it's more rapid. Good. It's good in terms of providing more employment over time. You know, it's a way to adapt technological change. It has a lot of linkages to other parts of the economy, and this was known. The economists at the time, fairly mainstream people, it changed the mainstream. It's like, you know, the American Republican Party. Well, that's changed a little bit. Used to be in pro-democracy, now it's a fascist party, you know, and the same thing. So it's been forgotten, but the mainstream people like Kuznets and Chenery understood that as income grows, the demand for manufacturing products is supposed to increase because higher growth of productivity also basically contributes to the growth of the sector. And there was some early econometrics work done by Chenery and his grad student who became a structural economist, friend of mine, Lance Taylor, you know, on what you'd expect in African countries of manufacturing relative to the GDP and population levels. I won't go through a lot of this. It's a table that comes from the mid-70s. But basically, what you found that during the colonial period, you in essence had much less manufacturing than you'd expect relative to the size of the country. So they used a kind of econometric equation of 48 countries by Chenery and Taylor. And all but Kenya, Congo, and Southern Rhodesia actually had well below the levels of manufacturing at independence that you'd expect from the per capita income. I remember some years ago, I was at Cambridge, probably 20 years ago, lecturing with Lance. He'd forgotten about the article. And I say, and he was a grad student at the time under Chenery. So, yeah, I know I remember that article, you know, and it was an interesting and important one that's sometimes forgotten. So there has been, over that period of time, dependency literature. And dependency economists said, well, that's the nature of the colonial powers because they want to keep Africa as an export market. And also they want to cheap sources of raw materials. But there's really more to the story of that period as to why the colonial powers were against manufacturing. One was that manufacturing threatened the import tax revenues, basically, which the colonies, it's not like today, right? You have income tax. Well, you can imagine trying to do income tax during that period. Even today in African countries, they can't do income tax. It's too complicated to get it. So they're always looking for ways of getting tax revenue because they put tremendous amounts of pressure on budgets. You know, I at one time back in the 80s, I spent some time in the Colonial Record Office, you know, and also in the kind of colonial project at Rhodes House. And it was amazing how constantly these guys, you know, they were sounding like they were sounding a bit like some of the right-wing people in some of these countries worried about balancing the budget. That's all they worried about was balancing the budget from the pressure that was put on them. And so one of the big sources of revenue, in fact, were revenues that came from imports. Well, if you had import substitution, that would remove that revenue. And so that was one of the reasons why the colonial governments were against it. They also basically, they didn't want to spend money. Well, what do you need for manufacturing? Well, you kind of need, let me think, roads and electricity and water supply. And things are expensive. You had to train your labor force. And the colonial governments had to be very parsimonious. And so what they tended to do is they tended to have to rely on their own self-sufficiency. And, you know, they had very tight controls on expenditures, even controlling their money supply. In Tanganyika, you couldn't actually expand the local money supply without depositing the equivalent in the treasury in London. It was an enormous constraint on intervening. And so the local demand for manufacturing goods was very limited because you had a very low standard of living, very low income levels. So you didn't really have the market in a lot of cases in overwhelmingly rural, poor peasant economies. And then finally, a lot of the you know, we talk about, you know, oligarchies and monopoly controls today. So we see in so much in the information technology industries. Well, we had it in those days. And these, there was a lot of big companies that controlled entirely import-export trade. And they didn't want their revenues threatened by having local manufacturing. So the French and British West Africa in 1930, basically, 60% of all exports and imports were controlled by simply foreign companies. Unilever, Compagnie Française de l'Afrique Occidentale, the John Holtz and Société Commerciale de l'Ouest Africain. So these guys completely controlled it. And so one of the problems was, if you then begin to try to build a manufacturing economy after colonialism, you kind of need entrepreneurs, something to know about manufacturing. They didn't exist, the indigenous ones. And a lot, of course, the colonists left after independence. So there was not a single African-owned and operated manufacturing company independence with more than 10 people, basically. And we're only basically not a single, vast majority of countries in independence, and only basically 10 people, employing 10 people or more in Kenya and Uganda into the region. Only 5 such firms were in Nyasaland and Tanganyika. So they just simply weren't a very paucity of people who are actually able to do that. Similar patterns with a lack of people that knew manufacturing among the local population and a whole host of countries that's been documented. Moreover, what you had is very extrinsic economies that were primarily interested in simply exporting minerals or cash crops, very small numbers. When we go back to 1959, this is people forget about this data, 92.7% of all exports in the colonial period in Africa were in agricultural and mineral commodities. And you say, okay, what happened over time? Didn't change much. We go to 1970, 92% is in these unprocessed raw materials, fuel, minerals, metals, and other primary commodities. Same number in 1991. You want to see some depressing figures? Look to 2024. Vast majority of years over 90%. Literally no significant change in the structure, this kind of colonial type structure that had been in place all the way from the 1950s during the colonial period. It's an extraordinary figure. You're looking at manufacturing. You're looking often at 11.9%, falling all the way to 6.8% in 2008. That was a period when you had very high prices of commodities, right? The global economy was expanding before the great crash. A little recovery afterwards, and increasingly what happened in this period following the Iraq War is the West started to rely more and more on African oil. And that became a significant part and really raised the quantity along with the price. I mean, that's an amazing figure. You look at the late 1950s, you look at the figure in 2024, virtual no difference, in the actual content of it. And we can also look at the data also on just some extraordinary figures just up through 2020, the latest data I can get. And you can see one is, of course, is the incredibly tiny government expenditures, the impact of neoliberalism, coming from the 20% all the way down to 9% or 10% of expenditures, way too low relative to what the function and its responsibility of the government is, way less than you find in OECD countries. And then also you find manufacturing domestically really peaking in the 1970s and 80s, I'll explain why, and then collapsing afterwards as a percentage of GDP. And we'll see if we look at the Kenya figures. They did manage to increase their exports, but relative to the economy, very little manufacturing going on. Incredibly tiny. You're looking at countries like China and others that have really expanded. You're looking offer manufacturing 30, 40% at its peak, that high, incredibly dominating, incredibly important as sources of employment, income, and structural transformation. So we see in the beginning, there was some manufacturing going on, some rise of it domestically. It was import substituting. For those that don't know what that is, import substituting means that you simply begin to produce what you've previously imported domestically in manufacturing. And the problem was that they did not generate manufacturing for export purposes. It often couldn't compete with the quality of the goods in much more advanced countries that used to come in. And so they had to rely on foreign exchange coming in from their classical, standard, colonial style types of extractive resources. And so you maintain the external structure relying on unprocessed raw materials and try to get your manufacturing going through import substitution, which had to rely very heavily on intermediate goods, capital goods, often even raw materials. I mean, it was always amazing to me, having spent many years in Tanzania and doing my PhD some years ago on planning in Tanzania, which I did go up and partly look at the industrialization planning. And it was just stunning to me that you put a textile plant in Tanzania, what do you use? Human-made products instead of local cotton. It was insane, instead of actually then providing the linkages associated for the farmers. But you did have rapid growth in manufacturing, basically exceeding 10% in 12 countries. Another 17 had rates between 5 and 10%. So it was really doing quite profoundly with manufacturing value added rising to over 20% of the economy. Begin to change though after 1973, with only 13 countries with growth rates of 5% or above, falling to only 9 countries in 79 to 86 period. So what happened? What was the story? I can't go through every country. So at one point I read through all the literature and I summarized it. So this was my reading of the nature of the manufacturing process that created the problems. One was a heavy reliance on what we call first stage import substitution, particularly luxury goods. So you're only producing for the local market. One of the things they'd often do, very famous, is they would import Peugeot kits from France, and it'd be for the rich people, right? And they come in and they'd assemble them, and that would be their import substituting. So they would no longer then import fully produced Peugeots in Tanzania. There was very high levels of imported technology, very capital intensive often, and it didn't generate the employment that one really needed. The manufacturing capacity had very high import coefficients. So in some ways, you're not, for the money you're saving, often didn't cover the cost of actually producing it because you were at very low levels of capacity utilization because it often relied on raw materials and spare parts from abroad. The products had very little export potential, so you couldn't generate foreign exchange with it. It took on huge amounts of loans, often from governments, then run sometimes by state owners that maybe weren't entirely prepared to run the companies, not trained as well, let opportunities and open for some corruption. Many new plants came through bilateral programs associated with aid conditionality. I always remember the famous baking equipment came on Swedish aid. It was written up once by some economists. And they wrote and they said, why is Tanzania with a huge amount of labor, importing a completely high capital intensive bread making machines. So you had one person when otherwise you could just simply hire them. So it was very inappropriate. There used to be a lot of work on inappropriate technology. This was very much done so. One of the things I read, I had the joy of my PhD reading through all these World Bank project appraisals, and I pulled my hair out. I couldn't find a single example when I interviewed people when I did my PhD of where they'd actually turned down a project. The World Bank in their appraisals approved everything. And then the World Bank had the temerity afterwards to say, you know, the problem with you, Tanzania, is your prices are wrong, and it's your fault because the state intervenes and creates all these distortions. Well, it was madness. It basically was really bad project appraisal done by the World Bank that screwed up. But of course, they had amnesia and forgot about their role. In a lot of cases, they'd invite multinational corporations and give them monopolies. And so local population had to pay higher prices. Very famous Firestone, other companies in Kenya and elsewhere that then got the monopoly access, for example, to tire production. And often then it was behind very high tariffs. As I've always said, tariffs are a great tool, but the stupidest thing you can do is get rid of tariffs. Equally stupidest thing is to keep tariffs on all the time. You need it as a mechanism of incentive to change the nature and dynamic of capital, as the Koreans did. Africa also simply lacked engineers and technical expertise. It was one of the problems. If we go back to Korea's huge transformation, the first thing they produced in the 1950s is a massive expansion in engineers. So these guys, when they got into industrialization, they had the ability to be able to adapt technology locally over time, you know, and then they heavily relied on engineers. It's always smarter to listen to engineers than to listen to economists, because the economists we have out today, because they're just much more knowledgeable about the things that are needed for transformation. So the result was a system basically that was much more dependent than before, relying on a handful of resource exports and leading to very huge increases in debt. And it led to the first debt crisis in the late 70s in Africa, when they had a decline in the terms of trade, you know, essence. And what you had also was just, you can see here, a crash in the terms of trades in the late 70s. So you were getting much less for your exports relative to imports, and that created a crisis because you're relying on the high prices of exports, you know, over this period of time. Of course, what you had in the late 70s was, for those who remember, it was the OPEC crisis, and the global economy went into a deep recession. And that hurt local prices. And then Africa, in terms of trade, what they got for their products crashed tremendously. So between 1970 and 80, in those days, gold and dollar reserves through the Bretton Woods system were in place, and they fell dramatically. You're down to only roughly 1.5 months of foreign exchange. I remember being in Tanzania in the early 1980s, you know, and there simply wasn't even enough money for alum for the water. So we turn on the taps and it'd be mud coming out, which is, you know, they didn't have bottled waters in those days. So it made my stomach very strong, but, you know, it was a very challenging situation. And so what happened is the foreign exchange markets, the private sector markets totally dried up. So you then had these African countries had only one place to go to, which was bilateral and multilateral aid. That's it, official aid. Because they were in debt, they couldn't pay it back, and that delivered into the IMF and the World Bank and the bilateral aid agencies, just as these countries see the rapid transformation of World Bank and elsewhere, moving away from a broad kind of basic human needs interventionist approach by the World Bank into a neoliberal approach. And so Africa then becomes, as I've written books and stuff on this, Africa became the great experiment for neoliberalism. It just became a source of experimentation economically, and it got copied elsewhere with devastating consequences, basically, at that point in time. And one of the key things was the deindustrialization, which was at the heart. You know, way back in 1992, I actually wrote an article on this, and I thought this is going to be massively deindustrializing on a theoretical level, and unfortunately it did. And so it led to a huge growth of deindustrialization through pro-cyclical macro policies, meaning even though the economy was going down, what the IMF and others do is they use a recession to get control of the balance of payments to lower the demand for imports. It makes things much worse. Very poorly conceptualized privatization, deregulation, and the dismantling of industrial policy institutions through loan conditionality. So in essence, you had the creation of a cartel of lending. So you're forced to adapt these policies. And by nature, as I'll explain, the policies were enormously deindustrializing. And whatever the industrial base was, it was really undermined and destroyed. And so you begin to get the fall of manufacturing value added. You're looking at the 20%, it's declining to 16% by 1990, collapses even further, basically. Annual terms in the 1990s, it fell by over 1% per year. We're talking about real terms, so in nominal terms, huge. And then reaching only 12% of total value added by 2000. So the logic and the argument, and I did have a few debates from these pro adjustment people, was, well, industries import liberalization, devaluation, reduction of protectionism, positive real interest rates, it will punish the inefficient ones, and the really good ones will survive, and prosper. It'll be more export-oriented, more labor-intensive, use more local raw materials, and hence pushing the country into its comparative advantage. So the comparative advantage theory, in very simple terms, if people don't know, is simply that you need to produce on what you can produce with relative efficiency, right? And it doesn't matter what you're producing. So if you're able to produce, unprocessed copper cheaper than manufacturing and importing cars, that's what you should do, because it doesn't make any difference. And so part of it was kind of like, as I used to say to my class when I taught international trade theory, comparative advantage, the logic of comparative advantage escapes most economists. And as I used to say, you can think about a shoe shine boy or girl, right? And it's like going to Africa and say, you can be a best shoe shine boy or girl in the world. Forget about becoming a lawyer or a doctor. And it's like entirely absent from that is a simple logic is your standard of living is incredibly linked to what you do, what you produce. And it's like myths. It's like, as I used to say, I think my 5-year-old at the time could have figured this out. Suppose these economists who would never tell their kids to be the best shoe shine boy or girl in the world, right? They say, well, go be a lousy stockbroker or a lawyer. You're going to make a lot more money, But for somehow they go to these other countries and say, no, just ship out unprocessed raw materials, because you can do that with comparative efficiency. So this was the madness of the logic. Even today, we still get it embedded among these economists, things they themselves would never actually use on a day-by-day basis. And so the idea was, well, it'll lead to prosperity and growth in the sector and contribute to an increase in exports while using fewer imports. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. It was a huge element of deindustrialization. I wrote a paper at the same time. I think the great Sanjay Alao passed away quite a number of years ago. Also wrote a paper predicting this. And then my old dear friend, Tandika Makandawari, has also passed away now 6-7 years ago, a brilliant heterodox economist, African of Malawian origin. Also, I always felt whenever I found something I thought was interesting and new, Tandika always had published something on it before me, and I learned about it after the fact. So if you ever want to look at absolutely brilliant economists of African origin, read his work. I mean, he's on so many different levels and so many different issues. His insights were really amazing. Anyway, so basically policies such as interest rate and exchange rate, liberalization, government expenditure cuts were almost bound to lead to bankruptcies and depressed markets. Privatization, basically to save state-owned industrial enterprises to a weak private sector, wasn't going to go anywhere. It led to thousands and thousands of enterprises being closed. And arguably, as I did at the time and elsewhere, if you simply had used rescue with interventional policies and kept some of those into place, you would be able to build and transform them over time. Instead, you had a massive closure with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of layoffs across the continent, and the loss of the knowledge. The accumulated knowledge is embedded in any manufacturing enterprise. It was lost, leading to this massive deindustrialization. Even worse was the demobilization of the industrial policy institutions that had put in place to be able to build what was done. Instead, the dictum became governments should abandon the practice of trying to pick winners, get out of the business of industrial policy, because they've consistently made poor choices in the past. As I said, poor choices. Wait, who was doing the project appraisals? Oh yeah, the World Bank. No, they didn't say we made poor choices. So the government's made poor choices. And so we take the example of development banks. Development banks are so important, industrial development banks, because it provides long-term capital. You're less worried about short-term profits. You give it to sectors which are higher risk. We've known for a long time, and even to the point where the Japanese had a big debate in the early 1990s with the World Bank, and they said, we think subsidized capital is really good. So they then had a huge, they then, and so the World Bank came and said, okay, why don't you just fund us with millions of dollars to produce what became the East Asian Miracle Study by the World Bank. And what did they do? They simply reaffirmed, well, really these governments were just following their comparative advantage. It had nothing to do with industrial policy and intervention. It was a market conforming. It was an amazing story, but not entirely surprising because of the message that they wanted to send out, being firmly kind of in the neoliberal approach at that time. So what happened with the development banks? It's a paper recently by economist, actually, he's a Burundian, was at University of Massachusetts, Leonce Nkamina. And he wrote a paper on development banks, which he said were a central part of the policy apparatus of the state. What would happen to them? So what are they doing? And so with we know from the 1990s onward, you often had to close these banks or change the nature of what they're doing as part of the financial sector adjustment loans of the World Bank. So the World Bank came in and said, you don't need these institutions, get rid of them. They create inefficiencies in the marketplace. They're not operating on the profitability. And so it led to the closing down really of hundreds of banks in Africa. And so we look, for example, they point out in the paper that Cote d'Ivoire had 6 very well-functioning, actually Cote d'Ivoire had a pretty sophisticated industrial sector, one of the more sophisticated in Africa, and they liquidated 4 of the 6 these 6 state development banks. One of the examples I traced historically was the Development Bank Finance Company of Kenya, which was set up in 1963, it's before independence. And it emphasized loans to existing enterprises. It did little change things. In the 70s, it began to increase lending to new enterprises. And increasingly in important areas, lending to agriculture, processing, engineering, construction, and textiles. They began to put in and create new sectors in chemical and pharmaceuticals in terms of the lending. It was doing the kind of structural transformation you need to diversify the manufacturing in Kenya, basically. It focused maybe a little too much on large and medium-sized enterprises. It began in 1978. It generated a new company called the Small Enterprise Finance Company to try to support small-scale manufacturing, which can be a very good source of employment generation, with 60 projects in 1978. And it was a significant amount of the exchange rate was 7 shillings to $1 in those days, up to 20 million. So we're looking at close to 2 million loans to larger enterprises. And financial institutions covered 10 to 90% of the project costs, still had to come to your financing. So perhaps one of the greatest thinkers at that time is my old dear friend, Gershon Ikiara, who eventually became Minister of Transport in Kenya, and he wrote some terrific books on industrialization, industrial policy in the 1980s. My first lecture I ever gave in Kenya was 1982, and he hosted me, so we've been friends since then. And he wrote, basically said, the conditions governing SEFCO, the small enterprise arm of the development bank, are more flexible as to reduce the problems hindering the penetration of indigenous Kenyans. This was the beginning. But unfortunately then, structural adjustment intervened. In 1997, it turned it simply into a commercial bank and got it out of the business of providing loans to the industrial sector. And then, of course, led to what was of growing importance to small enterprises, the closing down of SEFCO. So what's the current state of development banks? Not much of this is written, so it's hard to sometimes find the data. One of the data sources, and what Nkamina found, is at least those banks that have survived are doing part of their job. We don't know what sector they're doing, but they're providing longer term finance than normal banks, because typically commercial banks are very risk averse. They don't want to put money into something which takes time to return. And so they tapped and they found that there was comparable profitability, basically, 49 national development banks and They were having longer term lending compared to the private and commercial banks. So they're partly doing what they were doing. They predicted that as predicted, the share of medium and long-term loans was 22% higher for national development banks in the bank folks data compared to the private commercial banks, right? And so they were partly doing their long-term expectations, but there was really no data on what they were doing, what sectors they were providing in some senses. They found the profitability wasn't so bad relative to if you're a larger bank, you had to have profitability. Often they say, oh, they're unprofitable. In fact, the data showed they were not doing too badly. But what was really missing of this is the role potentially of these national development banks in supporting, as an industrial policy organization, supporting the development of enterprise, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And so the question became, what are they doing? We define an IPO in our new book called Entities of Containment with their own internal dynamics, basically fully able to shape industry, enhance procedural and conceptual capabilities, but also should be seen as intimately connected to other entities through organizational fields where correlated behavior arises from common meaning and purpose. Okay, well, that's a mouthful. But what we have then is it's part of an industrial policy framework, which is a broad network of government ministries, industrial policy organizations, private sector firms join in a coordinated effort towards industrial production. So what are these guys up to, these NDBs? None of that is in the Indocamina data, and so much of it is really unavailable. So what are these African banks doing? There is one other data source put out by the New Structural Economics, Justin Lin's group, and the Agence Française de Développement, which has documented 74 development financial institutions in 33 African countries. The biggest category of the bank has simply been a flexible group, basically some dealing with micro and small enterprises. And we go through the data, and sadly, of all of the banks that they've documented, only 6 were really doing with industry. That was it. They're not simply being involved with what was once the centrality of its role, which was providing support for industrial firms. And so one way to perhaps go forward with this, I'll talk about at the end by conclusion, is to talk about maybe doing industrial banks and industrial policy at more of a regional level. So what's been going on? What's the kind of thinking about industrial policy? So for the longest time, it was sacrosanct in neoclassical economics to talk about industrial policy because you're disrupting the free operation of markets. You're creating inefficiencies. So one of the approaches that's been to push back against that was Justin Lin. Anybody know who Justin Lin is? Anybody? Okay, so Justin Lin is a really interesting character. And I've met him on a few occasions. I have to say we kind of butt heads a little bit, but okay. So he's an interesting figure in the Chinese Communist Party. He actually swam in the other direction. He's Taiwanese. And he actually then swam over in his early 20s to communist China and joined the Communist Party. And so he's incredibly welcome. And so what did the Chinese do? They sponsored him to do a PhD at the most conservative neoclassical economic institution in the world called the University of Chicago. So the guy does a PhD, that's just like Friedmanite, free market economics, right? So he does it there. And of course, the idea is the Chinese are very smart and they're trying to provide legitimacy to what they're doing by trying to dress it up in mainstream economics, right? And so Justin Lin then became the first Chinese. I've had the honor of meeting a lot of World Bank economists over the years. Some have been friends. They even offered me a job there once. And, I sent it to my friend Tandika Makanda, where I said, they want to offer me a vice president job, at the World Bank dealing with human development. And so, I of course broke up laughing when I saw that, being a critic of the World Bank, and I just published a book. And then I sent it to my friend Tandika, and I said, hey, Tandika, they're looking for somebody to go work for the World Bank. And he writes back to me, he says, Howard, I thought we were friends. Why do you wish me such ill will? It was pretty hilarious. So Lin was a chief economist, first Chinese chief economist. Vast majority of the chief economists have been American, some European ones like Nick Stern from Britain. Basically, so for 2012, he was a chief economist. They have a lot of power. And he invented a an institute and a project called the New Structural Economics. And it was a position which said, well, you know, we got to have a reason for industrial policy. After all, that's what China's been involved with a lot of decades. So he then argues that prices may not be sufficient to encourage large-scale innovation, and hence governments can intervene to encourage firms to upgrade and diversify their production, right? So on what basis? Well, basically, he argues you can do that, but you still have to follow your comparative advantage, which is insane. You know, the idea is you're creating new efficiencies in new areas. And so it can be only comparative advantage following, not comparative advantage defying. And so the idea is, and he writes this, that Korea, which moved very early into steel and chemical industries in the 1960s with heavy government support, and he makes the argument, they were still following their comparative advantage. Now, how do you make the argument? Well, they built up capital endowments, and hence they have higher capital endowments, and that's the comparative resource position in successful industries like garments and footwear, and hence large-scale production wasn't so much out of line with a comparative advantage. Now, others said it's madness. I mean, you know, the level of GDP at that point was only 6% of the United States. To say that's comparative advantage falling was craziness, you know. And people like, it was a debate with my friend Hajun Chang and Robert Wade, and they basically said the position that Lynn is tautological, right? If an industry succeeded, it's only because it's following its comparative advantage. So it's like after the fact, you know. And so there really was no principle that he came up with actually defining the clear deviation of comparative advantage. And so how do you want to really know if you're deviating? We could say, well, if succeeding, it must be following the comparative advantage. So it's tautological. So we have a second approach you'll see, and this is what they pushed on me when I was writing the report in 2014. I wanted to use regional institutional economics. They said, no, you got to follow Roderick and Hausman. So this is another group of neoclassical economists. Much of their analysis simply focuses on industrial policy can be intervened only if you have market imperfections, such as, for example, the misalignments in the cost versus the resource rewards of the discovery process. And so basically, these kind of situations of externalities and others and the risks associated can lead to situations of distortions where markets are not a utility or welfare maximizing. And there's always a bit of a danger of neoclassicals intervening, creating rent seeking. So they still prefer in the market imperfections to deal with things like public goods, because then they argue you're not favoring individual good. For those with public goods, like building roads, building airports, building water systems, this way you're not choosing any particular group. But as Hajun Chang has pointed out, you know, any intervention by the state is going to reward some compared to others by nature, as to who's going to gain. And in some senses also, it's this kind of notion we always find in neoclassical economics that simply it's transactions between independent agents, basically, that coordinate through the price system. But the problem is that's not the real world. In fact, we know something like today, 2/3 of international trade are companies simply trading to themselves, right? And this by nature would be collusion. This is not the market. They're still living in this fantasy world, neoclassicals, and some of you have had courses, you'll see this. Often when I teach my classes, they won't let me teach in the economics department at the University of Michigan, but I often have economics students in my classes, and I say, am I misrepresenting what you guys are teaching? Not once in my 22 years teaching. They said, no, you're wrong, professor. I don't think they're just because they're scared of me, I'm going to give them a lousy grade if they give me a bad answer. No, it's because they actually get this crap. And they, and every now and again, I pick up the textbook, I say, really? So it's really ignores what is in fact today a value chain, supply-driven world by large corporations. And of course, the other problem is, which you'll never learn, is the idea of imperfections comes from a flawed theoretical construct. It's really no existence outside the contrived construction of neoclassicals, and you're inculcated with, well, there's this perfect information, there's this perfect market world, exchanging things. It's only if we get rid of these imperfections, you'll have the perfect world where we're all Pareto efficient, welfare maximizing, we're all maximizing our utility. How can you do any better than maximizing your own individual utility, in the analysis? And unfortunately, it's still the stuff that is taught. The problem is that is the precept of individual models of rational choice are then applied to collective action. And so you get what I call philosophically prescriptive consequentialism, which kind of replaces human reasoning and the generation of any strategies of intervention for the public purpose. And so in some senses, I think to really understand industrial policy, you've got to move away from the real world where economies are shaped by wealth, power, and ideas to really understand what's going on. So I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna I'll get a few more minutes. So it's okay. All right, I've covered a lot of ground, guys. So there's still more to go. So basically, and I could spend hours and hours on this. I'm going to go over very quickly. So what are the other constructs? If you're not going to use neoclassical economics, what do you use? There's actually some very, very insightful, deep theoretical approaches that can provide a lot of insight into the real world. One is four of them we use in the theoretical chapter: structuralism, an idea of a developmental state, the capabilities approach literature, and what I call original institutional economic theory. So each one would take hours and hours to go through. So let me give you a few highlights, basically. Structuralists kind of premise that economic development requires structural transformation, that economies are simply not very effective at dealing with, because you're shifting huge amounts of resources between sectors, and it leads to huge changes in the nature of wealth and income. The entrenched interests, or vested interests, as we say in original economic theory, are very much against it. And to do this, you really need government intervention with a big think and big interventions to alter the nature and structure of these economies. It's not going to happen through the marketplace, basically. And so you have to kind of intervene with new dynamic activities to diversify these economies, change the nature of the structures and technology, and think about actually moving from, which used to be thought about in Africa, moving from low productivity to high productivity levels of production, right? It's an incredibly important thing because, as I used to say to my introductory economics classes, I say, if there's one thing you're going to learn, this is it. Productivity rise is important, but there's no guarantee that productivity rise is going to lead to higher wages, because productivity rise either increases profits, lowers prices, or increases wages, or some combination of it. It's incredibly important to raise the standard of living. But in our world today, the vast majority over the last 30 years, particularly in the United States, has gone towards raising profits when productivity goes up, not wages. And not so much lower prices. And so what has happened over time basically is a huge drop in the standard of living, and it creates this massive marginalizations of millions of workers. They're lost unionization, no longer get a piece of the action, and increasing income and wealth inequality. Today, we have the worst income and wealth inequality that we've seen since before the Great Depression in the United States. It's frightening. And it leads to the kind of political implications that we see with the rise of fascism in the United States and elsewhere, where you have these oligarchic structures gaining power. And then when you remove all the barriers between the economic side with wealth concentration to the political side, you have then what is in essence a corrupt system. That's kind of a simple statement of why the United States has gone heading down towards full-fledged fascism. And so with huge amounts of oligarchic control. And so that's the real problem. But you need to, of course, not only raise productivity, you have to make sure that the productivity increases are shared with the vast majority of people, and that comes from a proper policy approach. In the United States, it was done through mass unionization and the keeping of industry, but they undermined it and destroyed it and moved so much offshore. So second, incredibly part of that is a kind of developmental state, a state that is entrenched in changing the nature of the market participants, the market incentives, dealing with reductions of risk, creating entrepreneurial visions, dealing with conflict. There's a very long and detailed literature of coming from people like Chalmers Johnson, Robert Wade, Alice Amsden, and Peter Evans. Political scientists. Robert Wade is an anthropologist, but actually almost finished his PhD in economics. I never got to meet Chalmers, but I chatted with the phone. I tried to invite him years to the conference. Robert Wade's been an old friend. I've met Peter a number of times, and I didn't know Alice very well. She passed away far too young an age. Bureaucracies basically conduct industrial policy. You need competitive recruitment, high levels of training, technological know-hows. You need also not full autonomy, but embeddedness in Peter Insinger, what we call basic embedded autonomy, where you have a private sector, but you also have a public sector working very closely with the private sector. often. Bureaucracies were never fully insulated from patronage, but there was a heavy emphasis on proper training. And there's also a notion that you do have ruling elites, but you don't have to embed them on various political ways. And there is kind of the growing what we call political settlements movement, which I now teach quite a bit on, which is interesting. It's the idea you have these political networks and this three-way linkage between political groups, political elites, economic elites, industrial elites, and bureaucracies, and setting up the base of power and understanding how you can build these coalitions to begin to put together the developmental state, because you're always going to have winners and losers. You have to make sure the winners work together politically behind successful industrial policy. I'm running out of time, so I'll go through this. One of the problems with political settlement, it's very hard. You can understand post factum how it's worked, but very hard on an ex ante way to predict what that coalition's going to be. The other issue which I want to talk about is the issue also of capabilities. And part of that is a third element, which is it's not just kind of having groups of wealthy elites, it's also having capabilities of capitalist groups and bureaucracies that are trained to be able to deal with industrialization. And it becomes very important to think about how you foster these capabilities. And one of the things we looked at is kind of the creation of knowledge communities and knowledge structures around different industries, which becomes incredibly important. I talk a lot about it in this book, and creating the variety of different groups that you can draw on as you begin to go through a transformation, into one product over the next. And one of the problems, of course, is that the greater the diversity and depth you have of knowledge communities, the more you can transform structurally these economies. But one of the poorest types of knowledge communities are those in extractive resources. They simply don't often spill over into the others. If you produce oil, it doesn't really help you with very much else, as we have in so many of these places. And so it's not so readily transformed. And then a fourth area I want to talk about very briefly is the area of institutional approaches. And so industrial development really is a complex process that involves massive amounts of institutional transformation. And in some senses, an institutionalist society really is a collection of institutional systems and sets of institutions. What are institutions? It's kind of socially prescribed core-related behavior. It's kind of the habits of thought common to the generality of men and women from the work of Veblen. Habits alone are not institutions, but predictable responses to contextualize stimuli invoking human dynamics that connects the thinking process. If you are going to operate a factory, you need to understand together how that factory operates. You have to understand the constructs of how you manage it, how you do the technology of it. What's your background in education? How do you fix the products when they fall apart? How do you create the quality of the product? How do you innovate? This is really a knowledge community in which you have a common set of constructs working together. And that's a very hard thing to build. So one of the things is that, I was very impressed when I visited factories and stuff in Tanzania in the 1980s, is there was knowledge communities around particular factories, including some processes of steel production they were doing. It was all lost from deindustrialization. And so the idea is it's not simply idiosyncratic, as we're all a bunch of individuals utility maximizing in an atomistic way, like in neoclassical economics. These are people operating with common unity of purpose, common constructs for coordination. And too often, there's not enough of an understanding of how you build this within industrial policy. And organizations are conceptually recognized entities that combine groups of people with defined common rules and purposes. So in some senses, as I've written elsewhere, IPOs are simply, organizations are simply types of institutional constructs. IPO basically are entities whose purpose is to create, support, alter, and transform industrialization. You also have to think about industrial policy frameworks. How do you build those? What are the component parts? How do they intersect? How do they interact? And you got to think a lot about what's there, what's been there historically, and how do you build it up? And so we're then looking at all sorts of IPOs dealing with engineering, marketing, finance, vocational, industrial census, policy coordinating units, et cetera, et cetera. There's a long list of things that have to be in place if you're going to operate in a constructive manner with coordination and unity of purpose. Now we can think about the IPRI framework, the ministerial relinkages to the private sector into these various organizations, creating what I call multiple organizational fields. So how do we understand, this is one of the things we've done in the book, we've come up with a construct of why institutions are not working. So we came up with what we call a construct called institutional failure. And institutional failure really is the idea that an industrial policy organization, framework or field, there's a systematic inability to reach goals set within that field. And so in some sense we can also think of institutional imperfections, where the field or the component parts are unable to perform effectively in a coordinated fashion to reach certain goals and functions. So we have failures where you're simply not reaching the goals of the institutions, and then different forms of imperfections with problems along the way. And so we've kind of developed a framework theoretically. We use these constructs to understand what has happened historically in the institutions of industrial policy. And we also have to think about what I call basically a static versus dynamic approach of industrial policy. And the static approach says, okay, how's it operating within the concept of what is created? The dynamic is, in what way is it evolving to deal with the underlying challenges of industrialization? And so, unfortunately, too often capabilities are simply not operating in the manner they have, as well as of these imperfections. And what we do is we throw the book and we say, where are we seeing this? Why has it occurred? To some extent, how can it improve? That's kind of an early thing I did. I want to spend a lot of time with the intersection of the two. So let me, in closing, spend a few minutes about Kenya. Let's put this framework into the real world. So our draft volume has extensive case studies of Nigeria, South Africa, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Kenya, along with lessons from Asia. Let me kind of give you some examples from the Kenya case. We look at the history of manufacturing in Kenya. I have to update this older graph now. You can see really pathetic levels of industrial policy in terms of value added, which is the bottom blue line. And some rise in the 1990s in the percentage of manufacturing and exports in Kenya, better than many other countries. We can see the levels of value added dropping to only 7.3%, meaning you're not generating many jobs in Kenya, but the manufacturing to exports relative to total exports of commodities getting up to the 20-30% range. We'll see, it could be problematic. This is the mapping out, don't let me go through all these, of all of the historical institutions dealing with industrial policy in Kenya, along with the policies that were put in place over time from the 1960s up to the present time. I'll go through a few examples. So basically, Kenya at independence inherited an industrial policy focusing on import substitution, which they continued for 2 decades during independence. The economy experienced pretty high growth of GDP during that period, and manufacturing also expanded at 10% per year in real terms. They called it in Kenya the golden age, the golden economic period. It involved and encouraged foreign private capital, which was one of the few countries that did that. There was a tremendous amount of capital flight, and they tried to correct that. So they enacted the Foreign Investment Protection Act of 1964 that allowed foreign companies to transfer profits, dividends, and capital abroad. And they were protected from nationalization. There was heavy emphasis on infant industry protection, again, along the lines I've suggested of import substituting policies, and reaffirmed in the second plan of 1970 to 1974, which focused on the use of import licensing, quantitative restrictions, duty drawbacks, and import raw material, hence protection of industries. It kept increasing in terms of the amount of employment of Kenyans. And the huge problem, of course, was the large transforming rural population trying to find jobs. And they also began to try to create jobs by barring foreigners from trading goods and granting citizens wholesale distribution rights. They covered a whole series of different types of products, basically, further amended in 1975. So they allowed the foreigners to come into manufacturing, but not so much in the distribution in some areas. And the emphasis was trying to increase African involvement in the management of firms. And so they created in 1968 the new project committee to review all applications by foreign companies intending to invest in Kenya, trying to push them to also hire more local people. And they negotiated duty exceptions, percentage of government shareholding, Africanization of management, technical fees, among others. Projects had to be then approved by a committee under the Foreign Investment Protection Act. And so they had the potential here of actually coordinating the centrality. So unfortunately, they didn't do a very good job of that. It was somewhat structurally hollow. And you had an opportunity to, at the very apex, to put together the senior level overseeing over investment, but it didn't happen. It was a kind of wasted opportunities. And the problem was they didn't have permanent staff. Normally, you look at the great industrial organizing, media and others, you always had full-time staff, full-time professionals in Japan, in Korea, in Singapore and Malaysia, but it wasn't there. And so it was very problematic. You had different groups coming together to review the positions, no continuity in the projects, and also prone to some extent of political interference. It was finally dissolved in 1985 after structural adjustment hit, basically. It was replaced by the Visman-Eisberg Group in 1983 with really little transformation and hence incredibly important central role led to a really systematic institutional failure dynamically. So we talked already about the Development Finance Company of Kenya and how it disappeared, but they had other IPOs operating. Let me go through a few others. One was the Industrial and Commercial Development Corporation, which was actually inherited from the colonial period, wholly owned by the Kenya government, mandate to increase indigenous participation in industrial and commercial development, save foreign exchange, facilitate rural development, use more local raw materials, and generate jobs and diversification of the economy. It performed moderately well, but was really critiqued for failing to meet one of its major objectives, which was trying to encourage small enterprise development. The security required was very large and actually excluded a lot of local entrepreneurs. And it was a serious institutional imperfection. You could have come up with mechanisms to support that, to deal with small entrepreneurs, but they didn't. So it didn't follow its mandate very well. Tried to exist in improving conditions and frameworks. And so it then added another innovation. It created the Industrial Development Bank in 1973. So you now had three altogether financial institutions or development banks dealing in Kenya. It was established to promote joint business opportunities, provide financial services, working capital, support purchase of capital equipment, trade facilitation, et cetera, for medium and large enterprises. They had problems already with international finance, so it had to take on securing loans from the World Bank and Morgan Grenfell and Company with guarantees from the German and UK governments. Perhaps too much enterprise and actually too much emphasis in supporting multinational enterprises. But still, it did experience tremendous growth, played a crucial role in providing funds to enterprises. First 10 years, funding 33 key projects with large loans, nearly 40% of its portfolio in key industries like metals, textile, and agro-processing. It did have institutional imperfections and poor connective failures, what I call, with large and growing arrears in foreign exchange. So Kenya came along and said, okay, let's continue what we're doing. Let's improve on it, 1979 to 83. But unfortunately, a year later, the first structural adjustment program coming into Africa hit in 1980. It was displaced in 1980 by the sessional paper 94, followed with 1982, where the Kenya, which was in a financial crisis, had to turn to the World Bank and IMF and donors, and then adapted structural adjustment. And so it had to shift away from trade restrictions, expenditure cuts, put in tight monetary policy, freed up energy prices, avoided wage increases, and basically led to the end of the import substituting approach. Industry was supposed to become more efficient along the lines of neoclassical terms. The industry-focused papers said, well, they've got to follow their comparative advantage. But beyond some paper understanding how you move from import substituting industrialization into export orientation overnight. no mechanism, somehow it's all going to happen. And in fact, out of 100 projects that DFC was involved with, only 9 earned any foreign exchange. Vast majority were using foreign exchange. It was closed down. And then there was huge issues where all sorts of problems, CDC and DBI, in supporting export orientation. So in essence, I want to kind of close this area and come to the conclusion that not too much time. And so over the course of decades, of addressing and building on existing institutions, institutional weaknesses, it was abandoned. Much of the existing capabilities of IPO were never upgraded and put in place. A lot of them were closed. There was no alternative system to actually then put in place industrial accumulation and structural transformation. And so you go through a whole series of things. Ministry kept changing names, 1998, 2010, 2016, 2020, 2023, constant shifting on ministries and responsibility and its connections to other industries. Not what you need in terms of institutional continuity. Created the State Department of Industry finally in 2013, but its impact has been highly limited. Information. So I want to now turn to the conclusions. So I've tried to present an alternative set of basic theoretical tools to assess weaknesses of existing industrial policy approaches in Africa. I want to suggest 2 possible ways forward. One of the great problems we have, as I've written, is you're dealing with economists who are now trained in neoclassical economics who don't have a clue about how to go about doing industrial policy, industrialization. It's a huge issue. So how do you begin to deal with this lack of institutional mechanism, organizational structures and capabilities and building it up? One thing is you need a developmental state, but you can't really do it overnight. So one of the things I've suggested are creation, some of it comes from the literature, and we call pockets of efficiency, where you begin to kind of put together pockets of efficiency or effectiveness to build capabilities around a particular industry, and then build out from that point. And I go through different systems here of different approaches I had to do bit by bit to put these coalitions together to build these capacities and efficiency and to begin to build out. A second approach I think is possible is this massive expansion of regional economic arrangements. I'm actually writing a paper on this right now. Huge increase you can see of African RTAs. So you can look at the basically in goods and the blue line, the goods, 50 some odd economic arrangements today, up from just a handful in the 1960s that are available. A regional economic arrangement, you simply what you're doing is you're putting together some form of customs union, some form of maybe free trade arrangement between countries. Increasingly now is the huge increase in the new proposal of the African common market. I'll talk about that briefly afterwards. And so basically, you also have to begin to think about these economic arrangements and putting in place not your standard neoclassicals, but economists are going to be much more diverse in their thinking, much more pluralistic. And so regional arrangements are best seen, in my view, from an institutional economic theoretical perspective that can transcend the limitations of individuals' countries' ability to mobilize finance and other resources to generate new manufacturing capacities while providing in a large market. So often, when you're looking at the neoclassical theory of regional economic arrangements, it's simply saying, is it going to lead to trade reductions or trade expansion? And that's all they're looking at as their measurement of welfare. Very little thinking about how you can actually begin to use a kind of regional economic arrangement, some kind of bank that covers multiple countries, to be able to actually then build up industrial policy capabilities. So we've written a paper with my former PhD student, Michael Olabisi. We wrote a paper on creating what we call an African Green Bank, which gives some ideas of how you deal with that. And we've made up of 7 divisions. One basically a green energy producing unit, because right now you have an opportunity to transform in green industry and green energy, in which you then have a green energy production unit trying to bring wind, geothermal, solar, tidal energy projects, as well as green related infrastructure. And then something dealing with promoting agriculture related value chain activities, basically to support the integration of food processing across multiple African countries. Also looking at the downstream processing and manufacturing activities with mining and materials for renewable energy transition, things like aluminum, cobalt, and lithium, as well as rare earth metals in dysprosium and terbium. Unit 4, expanding with climate change adaptation, goods production, encouraging value chain integration, development, and supporting commercialization of end products. 5th unit, dealing with an investment intermediary that attracts foreign capital investment to green industries in Africa. 6th, dealing with extension service to assist green energy projects. One of the things you need to have engineers, business people that go and help these industrial enterprises. You need to concentrate the brightest and the best in a place and send them off as an extension service. This is something that Taiwan was very famous for. You've heard of agricultural extension, they had industry extension. When a company is operating, they would send the brightest, well-trained people to help the company go through its transformation. Unit 7 would be kind of like a holding company. The idea of an African Green Bank would, a regional arrangement which would cover the whole continent, would then have shares in these companies along the main banking line. In the main banking line, you always had one business that had maybe 5% shares in the company that oversaw would transform so they could follow what happened to loaning. And within it, you need really to be staffed by the top engineers, scientists, and economists trained in pluralist economics. So most African countries do not have familiarity with industrial policies. You can think about building up, with the example of using the African Green Bank, entirely reconceptualizing regional economic institutions to undertake IP, basically, as a way of moving forward. So you then have scarce resources, scarce thinking, make it available within regional trading groups. There is now, as we said, the new African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I've done a lot of reading on it. The jury is still out on whether they can actually undertake this. For a whole lot of reasons, I'm not that optimistic. But the important thing is to begin to think where you have a lack of a population. I remember in 1999, I gave a lecture to the East African community that was being reformed. And I said, you should be thinking about this as an industrial policy bank. This should be seen as a way in which you specialize. You have a huge market in East Africa, over 100 million people. Why don't you then create a regional economic arrangement in which you provide support to industries and specialize in different countries, then have access to the whole market? Because you then have the possibilities of economies of scale and learning, and then provide the support of it. And I sat there with a room full of people trained in probably mostly neoclassical trade theory, and they had a blank look on their face. They didn't know what I was talking about. Because for them, a regional trade arrangement is simply a second best solution to free trade. Because free trade is the answer to all of your problems. Open up, deal with the efficiency, and deal with it, instead of actually thinking in a critical manner. So at this point in time, along with others, it's time to kind of dramatically confront what is in essence the entrenched interests and the ways of looking at the world, to challenge it in new ways if we're going to begin to deal with the huge needs of the continent in the 21st century. Let me stop there. Thanks.